studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
Joining me now from Cambridge is John Burns. He is with the New York Times, has been the Baghdad bureau chief there, and knows as much about this war as anyone that we have talked to who has been covering that as a journalist. Thank you for doing this.
It's a pleasure, Charlie.
Tell me, how do you see it from afar, now that you've been looking at this for a while out of Baghdad? You're about to go back. Does it look any different?
Well, from what I've been seeing since the surge began, there's no doubt, which was quite predictable, that it's had the effect of lowering levels of violence in Baghdad, and that's important. Of course, the big question is, for how long? And is it simply a question of the insurgents melting away, trading, as one American military officer put it to me in January, trading territory for time, that is to say, giving up their control of certain areas of the city, knowing that the clock is running in Washington, D.C., and that they can resume later, that they, in other words, they can outwait President Bush and the Congress of the United States. So it's difficult to tell where this is going, and I believe General Petraeus has said as much. But initially, it does look as though the surge is having at least some of the effect that was desired.
Part of the surge's tactic or strategy is that it'll give time to build political issues and political will. Is that happening on the ground?
You know, it's a kaleidoscope in Baghdad. Things change very quickly, and I've been gone now for a month or more. It's difficult to judge exactly from this distance, but I think one thing you can say is that this desired, if you will, development of a political consensus, or indeed of a sustainable political system in Baghdad, I think everybody recognizes this is not a work of 3 months or 6 months or even 3 or 5 years. It's going to take a very long time. And for every step forward, it seems there's at least a step back. They've made progress on the oil sharing agreements, the sharing of oil revenues, and on some other fronts. But I think we're going to see continued fractiousness because this is really all, after all, the whole issue here is power, the division of power between Shiites and Sunnis, principally Kurds as well. And that's a historic issue and is going to take a generation to settle.
Who has the incentive or the will to make a political initiative?
It's hard to see it, especially given the uncertainties now that hang over the American presence there.
Have you seen or know anything about the Maliki government wanting to reach any kind of settlement with the insurgents and with the Sunni in order to have that political process that they think is necessary?
Well, of course, we've seen just within recent days fresh reports of Iraqi government officials at a senior level saying that there have been contacts with the insurgents. When I read that, when I see that, when I hear that, I have to say I'm very skeptical because we've been hearing it almost since the second phase of this war began. I don't think that the Sunni insurgents, nor indeed many in the Sunni community, are prepared to bargain for a fraction of power. And that's all it would be if it were strictly democratic or strictly proportionate to numbers. I think that there's still a strong feeling in the Sunni community that this whole game can be reversed. And as I think I've said to you before, Charlie, I think that the Sunni minority in Iraq regards itself not so much as a minority as the vanguard of the great Sunni majority in the Arab world. And so I think the struggle is likely to continue, that efforts to bring about reconciliation, particularly between the present government and the insurgent groups, are likely to falter. And it's difficult to see anything but more trouble ahead.
What do the Sunnis want?
Well, certainly as far as the Baathists are concerned, I don't think there's any willingness to contemplate a future of shared power, not after the best part of 1,000 years in a position of domination in that part of the world.
What do you think America wants now?
What do I think America wants? I would guess America would be prepared to pay almost any price to get home, and leave behind a situation with which Americans and Iraqis could live.
There are those in the region who think the United States wants to continue to have bases there for a long time. A lot of Iraqis believe that. Based on the military men and the political men that you talk to on the ground in Baghdad, do they believe that?
You know, I don't think that most of the military commanders there think in those terms. I think that they have a more immediate mission in hand, and they're prepared to leave that to the politicians in Washington, D.C. When they talk about future military bases, what they're talking about is the 3 or 4 major bases outside of the major Iraqi cities that they think they will need in the, if you will, medium term. That is to say, when American troops begin to pull out of the cities, this is the hoped-for outcome of the present surge, to pull out of the cities and leave security in the cities to Iraqi troops and Iraqi police, then to withdraw to, as a kind of guarantor of last resort, to 4 or 5 major military bases outside the city. I have not heard American commanders talking about any longer term. I think what one senses is that they, as much as the majority that is reflected in American polls at home, really would like to get this Army and the Marine Corps and other military units home. I think that there is a serious concern about what this is doing amongst the American commanders, what it's going to do to the Army and the Marine Corps. I think that they feel now, as many commanders did in Vietnam, that the longer this goes on, the more it erodes the essential strength and certainly the morale of the American forces.
You and I have talked many times about what happens if they pull out before there's any security that will last. Obviously, you have some security in Baghdad that seems to be building, but it may not last once the Americans leave. There are others who say to me, no matter how bad it gets, there is nothing we can do, and we can't stay there, so the catastrophe is already upon us.
Well, it's certainly a sustainable argument. Of course, if you live in the midst of all of this, as I and my colleagues have done for the past 4, in my case, going on 5 years, you're very influenced by concern for the Iraqis themselves, the people that we know, the people we've seen to suffer so greatly from the past several years. And that inclines one to any solution which will avoid worse bloodshed than there already is. But, you know, it was very clear to me when I visited the United States that there's the American interest in this, of course, ultimately with the Congress of the United States and the people of the United States, the American interest that's going to prevail. And there is, of course, such a strong desire to have the troops home and to have this ended. It's an extremely difficult knot to untie. And how that will be untied, I don't know. But I think it is safe to say that the American presence of American troops, costly as it is in blood and treasure to the United States, is a major, it sounds odd in a situation of chaos to say it's a stabilizing force, but absent that presence, the potential for the situation getting not just worse, but dramatically worse, is very high indeed. To avoid that, is it worth to continue to spend $8 billion a month and, you know, another 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 American combat casualties? That's something that only the American people, the American Congress, can decide.
I'm struggling to understand if this is not the reality, and I'm asking this in a journalistic conversation. The reality is that the United States and its coalition forces have been defeated in Iraq, and they need to recognize that. And anything else they do in the hopes of avoiding a catastrophe is simply risking more and losing more. Tell me why that's wrong as a journalistic conversation.
I wish I could tell you that it was wrong, Charlie. You know, are there any certainties in all of this? No, there are probabilities. I would say the odds are against, indeed heavily against, the United States being able to turn this situation around. But
or
not
even
yet
achieve a partial victory
exhausted.
of any kind. Or even achieve some partial.
Very, very improbable. And the price, of course, is very high indeed. But, you know, I think that those who would make the argument for an early withdrawal have got to deal with what the consequence is, not alone for Iraq, which would be very serious indeed, but what the consequences for the region and indeed for American interests and American power would be. I'm not to say that that kind of argument should prevail, but I think it should be made. It should be discussed, because I think those consequences would also likely be fairly serious. I think that the consequences for some of the neighboring countries would be serious. They certainly might be serious for the state of Israel, given the radicalization that would likely ensue of the region, and surely it would have a major effect on the perceptions of American power in the world. Perhaps all of that is a price America is going to have to pay in the end to get out of Iraq. And I don't think any of my colleagues, and I'm not just talking about New York Times colleagues, but other journalists in Iraq, I don't think we have any clear-cut answers about this. And I think everybody wishes that there were clear-cut answers. And in the end, some very, very painful decisions are going to have to be made. And when I reach this point in the discussion, I have to say I'm thankful for what Teddy Roosevelt used to said, as you know, about people in our profession, that we were in the bleachers, that we're not in the arena. We don't have to expend, as he said, our blood, tears, toil, and sweat. Although some journalists have, of course, died, and many journalists have died in this war, it's our privilege to not to be in the business of having to make these extremely, extremely painful decisions.
I'm just trying to understand at this 4th anniversary, all the conversations that you and I have had, where exactly we are, and if the final chapter is not being written now, and it's clear to most people where it is headed, and to understand the factors at this last chapter which will determine how it might end. And finally, if there is one last effort, which the surge might be, to create some stability in the hopes that a political consideration will be in play, how long do they have? If this last window is still open, how long do you think it's open?
That's really the heart of the problem. I mean, when I spoke to some fairly senior officials of the administration in Washington, D.C., they were almost all saying, we've got to have signs of significant progress by the fall. Why? Because of the political calendar in the United States, with certainly after Labor Day, the presidential election, of course, beginning to move ahead at some speed. The argument that for keeping the American troop presence there, of course, has to be made before that. They have to show progress. Can they show progress? They're showing some. But even if they do, of course, the argument will still be made that it may be illusory. We've seen progress before, only for it to fall back on itself soon enough. I have to say the situation does look pretty bleak. But I would also say, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself here, that I think it's probably wrong to say at this point that the situation is hopeless. There's been a significant change in American military strategy. There's been a change in command, as you know. The surge was always going to have its effect. Putting more American boots on the ground would have its effect. You know, is it enough to persuade the American public to continue with it over the much longer period of time that will be necessary? Not 6 months, not 12 months, more like 3 to 5 years or more. Impossible to tell. Impossible to tell. And as I said, the situation is really very tragic.
If, in fact, somehow the surge leads to, you know, what in the end everybody hopes for, some kind of peace and some kind of settlement, then we all should hope that the surge works and enables people to reach some kind of solution, because it has been 4 long years of death and destruction and refugees and families torn apart. You have helped us understand it and will continue to do so, and I thank you for joining me this time.
Thank you, Charlie.
John Burns from Cambridge on his way back to Baghdad. Back in a moment. Stay with us. We begin this evening a series of conversations about American foreign policy, the future of American foreign policy. We are calling it A Memo to the New President. It is about where we go after Iraq, understanding that Iraq and the questions it raises have not yet been fully decided, but we wanted to understand how a series of people feel about America's future and its role in the world. We began this evening with the former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Next week, we'll talk to former Senator Bill Bradley, Newt Gingrich, Madeleine Albright, and many others about how they see this idea of America's future. But we begin this evening with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. You're writing a memo for the next president, and you want to explain how you see the imperatives of our time and America's role. And you begin, at least, with an understanding that Iraq could go one way or the other. What would you say?
I would say that the problems that we recognize today won't go away with the new administration, and that the margin of the range of available choices is not determined by which party governs in the United States. But I would say you have three fundamental problems and challenges in the world. You have the challenge of in the North Atlantic area, which I would define as globalization. That is to say that the states, the European states, are diminishing in their role as national states, and that the relationships are primarily determined there by economic and social conditions, and that the challenge they face is the gap between the requirements of globalization and the impact of that on the national consciousness by which the average person still orients himself. Secondly, you will have in full force the fact that the center of gravity of world affairs is shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that you have China, to some extent Japan, India, coming up as countries that conduct foreign policy the way the Europeans used to conduct it before World War I, but no longer are able to for the reasons that I gave before. And third, you have the ideological, religious impetus that comes from the Muslim world. And those three issues do not permit the same methods in each case. And you will have to conduct a far-sighted policy with respect to each of them without being able to put them under one formula that applies to all of them. And that's a very tough assignment.
Are the lessons of Iraq, we didn't understand the culture of the place? Are the lessons of Iraq having to do with we did not appreciate multilateralism in the same way that we did in the Gulf War? Are the lessons of Iraq that you cannot achieve negotiating objectives if you don't have military control?
America is always under the temptation to believe that every problem in the world can be solved by American precepts and the American experience. So the idea that a democratic government with parliamentary methods always guarantees peace and always produces stability, that's sort of a natural view that Americans have had throughout American history.
From their optimism.
From their optimism and from the fact that this is a society whose citizens turned their back on the mother country as immigrants and never had to face a foreign invasion or foreign dangers. But one result, for example, in a country like Iraq is we believe that if there's an election, out of it emerges a legitimate government which has the sanction of the people. But if you have a multi-ethnic or multi-religious society, then what the elections do is deepen the disagreements because most people will vote for all people will vote for their ethnic or religious groups who are now then legitimized by an election. And in Iraq, the fact of an election has produced a government, but it hasn't produced acceptance of that government by the minorities that inevitably result from an election. So in order to have a democratic system, you must have a society in which people believe that the maintenance of the society is more important than any differences within it. And therefore, we in the United States can have an election. And even if we are disgruntled by the outcome, we have a shot at the next election. That is not the way they perceive it in multi-ethnic societies, and certainly that's not the way they perceive it in Iraq. And then it's the fact that the surrounding countries have a vested interest in particular aspects, Turkey in the Kurdish area, Iran at a minimum in the Shia area, and probably in the whole...
And the Saudis
in the Sunni area. So what we have here is an international conflict and an ideological conflict and a sort of a civil war all running together. And it was certainly a failure not to analyze ahead of time what the
forces at work were.
What the forces would be that would emerge.
Let me ask you this. Does it, in the end, suggest limits on American power that this country now has to appreciate as it designs a foreign policy for the future?
Any foreign policy has to be clear about objectives, and it has to be clear about limits. If it cannot do either of these, or if it fails in one of them, it is going to be in deep trouble.
Are we at one of those moments in history in which there is the necessity for a new world order? A, because of what's taken place in the Middle East, the rise of different kinds of groups, and B, what's happened in Asia, meaning that there has been a shift from the West to the East?
There's a need for a new world order, but it has different characteristics in different parts of the world. Just to go back to Iraq for a moment. Right. On the one hand, the manifestations of what is going on in Iraq are depressing and give some occasion for pessimism. On the other hand, simply it's looking at somebody as a student of the future. I find it sort of interesting that there is now going on, there are conversations inside Iraq between the various parties, not going very far yet. Secondly, that there is a meeting of ambassadors which will graduate to foreign ministers of all surrounding countries, plus Egypt, plus the members of the Security Council. And that people are talking of broadening yet a third level in which you would bring in India, Pakistan, Indonesia. Now, none of this may succeed this time, but this to me is sort of the outline by which someday in the next few years a solution will emerge, that people will look into that cauldron and decide that they have to learn their limits, not just we, but everybody else. In Asia, its situation is different. In Asia, you have powerful countries emerging that think of the world in essentially strategic terms, very similar to, say, Europe in the 19th and early 20th century. And that in terms of the overall resources in the world, there's a significant shift towards Asia. Now, people talk about the rise of China, and Chinese say that they are restrained, and I think they are restrained.
What is restrained?
Restrained in the exercise of their power. the Chinese up to now. But the fact is that there is a shift in the economic realities of the world and even in the military realities. So then the question is, will this be carried out like traditional, what one knows from history? From history, one would learn that the relationship is very similar to that of Germany to Britain at the turn of the 20th century. Germany, a rising country, Britain, an established country. And it eventually led to war. But we have new conditions in many respects. We have a technology by which every leader knows that a war between major countries is such a catastrophe for the world that it is hard to imagine any benefit you can gain that is proportional to the suffering. So, secondly, there is a set of problems: environment, climate, allocation of energy, that can only be solved on a global basis.
But that's a call to multilateralism, is it not?
That is, yes, except the way multilateralism is often used is a sort of procedural way of having more nations involved. But multilateralism, which was a technique before, has now become a necessity. And if you look at the energy picture in the world, and you see that the demand is rising and the supplies are not rising at a similar level, then it will either lead to colonial wars of the 19th, early 20th century time, or to some system by which people agree among each other how the supplies are going to be shared. Now, that's a new concept that hasn't happened yet. So I think whoever becomes president, whatever party, they will have to deal with these issues. And I want to make one point about globalization. It's always discussed in economic terms that everybody is better off, but that is only partially true. Everybody is better off on the average, but in some countries or in some regions, people lose their jobs, major adjustments have to be made. That's the engine of globalization. The people who are disadvantaged by the process look to their governments for solutions. But the governments are national and the problem is global. So how to bring about a relationship between the desirable process of globalization and its impact on the politics?
You're encouraged that China will get better and will grow and will be a more responsive citizen of the world?
I could write a script where this will not happen, because the pressures inside China are enormous to deal with so many
But it's
problems.
incumbent on the next president to be able to...
I would say to the new president what I'm saying to the current president, or I've said to previous presidents. The relations with China are the fundamental challenge of American policy. Because if we get that wrong, then much else we may do right. It's going to be subsumed in an attention to a conflict like the Cold War. And that is something that we must really avoid. And if we want to have a constructive world, the purely strategic and military problems that the shift in power relationships brings will confuse us if we do not consider that we have to bring about, together with other countries, a different consciousness of what a world order is.
I'm interested in the sense of, let's assume he or she is interested in what do they want. I've got to craft a new policy. What do they want? What does Putin want? What does Hu Jintao want? And what do the rulers in Iran want? And do they want the same thing? Power in their region, to fully participate and be recognized for the power they have, and respect from the world community.
I think each country is influenced by its culture. Hu Jintao probably understands what I have described quite well, because China has had to exist for 4,000 years as a country that was either dominant or its own internal divisions broke it up. It has never had to deal with other countries on a basis of absolute equality. So when they see this emerging, they might have the temptation to dominate it, but this is not the style in which they would normally operate. Whether he would understand the American mentality well enough, that's his challenge. But it's also our challenge about China. You cannot do what I'm talking about without some understanding of the culture of the other countries, and without understanding that when you talk about world order, you must create something that the other party has an interest in maintaining, not something that it is forced to accept, but something that it wants to accept.
Okay, so take that. What do you say to the Iranians? What should the next president say to the Iranians if we have just gone through a period in which they believe they benefited from the Iraqi war?
Absolutely.
Because an old enemy has been destroyed.
There are two possibilities with the Iranians now, and I don't know which road they'll take. On the one hand, they could say, this is the best opportunity we've had since the days of Darius, maybe. We have a vacuum in front of us. We're building nuclear weapons, and there's no great determination except by the United States to stop it. And we'll keep going, and we'll try to quiet down the Americans by occasionally mumbling about negotiations. That's one road they could take. The other road they could take is to look at the world and say, with all the mistakes the Americans have made, we're a rather weak country, and they are a very powerful country. Maybe there's only a 5% chance that they will retaliate against us if we provoke them. But that's not the way it works, because if it happens, it's 100%. So how much do you need? What risk does there have to be before they are cautious? And if they look at, say, Iraq and the Middle East, yes, they have an option to try to keep it boiling. But they also have to consider that no American administration, no matter what they say now, is going to accept a hostile domination of a region of such important to energy for the world. And they could get drawn into a conflict with the Sunnis and with us. So I could imagine, I'm not saying that they're not at that point yet, but I don't exclude that they're beginning to have second thoughts, so that I could imagine that they go to a negotiation detesting us, but trying to make the sort of accommodation for, say, 5 years of calming things down. Do I know which way they will take? No. I would say to the president, you have to be ready for both. But you mustn't talk yourself into a frame of mind where your rhetoric forces you into one direction or another.
Someone on this program last week or this week suggested that it is not the end of the world if Iran has the nuclear weapon, and that we ought to come to them and say, okay, you're going to get a nuclear weapon, but how do we develop a relationship? Because they, like the other countries you have mentioned, understand mutually assured destruction, that they will be, if they launch a nuclear weapon, if they have one and they launch it in the region, they will be destroyed, and they understand that. And the risk is nuclear proliferation, but not the fact that they have a weapon that they're going to use.
No, but what worries me with respect to proliferation, it's this, and I may have mentioned this on your program before, if I had to state what worried me most when I was in government, wasn't any of the issues that one reads about so much, Vietnam or whatever the problem was. What worried me most was what is my responsibility as one of the 3 or 4 people who will be asked when the president asks me, do I use nuclear weapons here? And the dilemma it produced in my mind was I would know this kills tens of millions of people. And you can say you have no right to do that. But if you say that, and then you turn the world over to the people who you know have no hesitation to kill tens of millions of people. So we navigated this in our administration, in the administrations before us, in all the administrations of the Cold War. But that's because it was a 2-power world. If you have a 20-power world, then every nuclear country has to make the same sort of calculations with a much larger number of people, with much less technology available to protect the weapons. Then I think some use of nuclear weapons somewhere along the line, it's almost inevitable. And if the world should wake up one day and find that 200,000 people have been killed in one day or more, the world will never be the same again. So I think in a way Iran and to some extent North Korea are sort of the test case whether we can avoid this. But I would add to it, and I've recently written an article together with George Schultz, a bipartisan article, nonpartisan article with 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, to say, yes, we have to keep new countries from getting nuclear weapons. But the countries that have nuclear weapons also have an obligation to show that they are reducing their reliance on this so that we can move towards a world in which the nuclear element in the military field becomes less and less.
Is there at this time, and looking forward to 2008 when there will be a change in Washington, an imperative to recognize that we have seen limits on our power, that our credibility has been eroded, and that our image around the world has been damaged, and therefore a crucial element, a crucial need for the new president is to restore credibility, restore respect, and begin to build a new consensus for America?
Yeah, I agree with that up to a certain point, but we also have to recognize
that we've lost credibility, that our image has been damaged, and that we have seen limits on what we can achieve.
Yes, but some of these qualities are also reflections on the people who are fostering these ideas. I think that the image of the president that has been created in Europe is absurd and, in a way, a cop-out.
Wait, I need to understand what you mean by that, because Europe is Germany and France and Italy. And
well, in much of the media, I think that President Bush has understood that there is a fundamental problem. That there is what perhaps it's wrong to call it terror as such, that there is a universal movement that is attacking our values and our institutions, and that has to be resisted. That is an important insight.
Okay, go ahead.
Some of the methods that were used were not effective, and some were not wise. But I don't want the American president to come into office from a posture of guilt and
or weakness
and self-flagellation.
Right. The Bush administration, and I think they would say, all of them would say this, came to power with the idea that we can remake the world. Perhaps because it was a sole superpower, perhaps because it saw a need, a reason to pursue an agenda that would remake the world, And part of that remaking the world was democracy. Is that wrong? I mean, should the new president say, I can't remake the world, I can't create democracies around the world, and that's a waste of my time?
No, an American president always has to believe in the values of its country. And the particular aspect of America is that its people have always thought that they represented some unique values. And that should not be abandoned. What the American people have to learn, however, is that in the past, most of our problems have proved to be soluble, and soluble by the application of a lot of resources. Now we have to understand that a problem is part of history, and that no problem, or that fewer and fewer problems can be finally solved. They can be ameliorated, they can be improved, you can move in a better direction. And so we have to learn how to embed our values into a historical process and not insist that unless you get final answers, you have failed totally.
How do we embed our values in a process? I mean, is that a call, for example, for the use of soft power?
Certainly soft power is an important aspect, and I believe in general, even having written a lot about military strategy, I believe that military strategy will be of less significance, although we still have to have, I'd still like us to be the most powerful country or one of the most powerful countries in the world. But, Iraq is not a good example, but it's very typical of America to put down 200 benchmarks for a country that's just getting a government in the middle of a civil war.
We're setting benchmarks for the Iraqis, and they hardly have the power, even if they have the will to do it.
I agree with most of these benchmarks.
But you don't think they can achieve it, and it's an unfair test for them?
They can't achieve it in a year.
Is the Islamic revolution, in its fundamental violent aspect, more of a threat to America than the Russian Empire was, or the Soviet Empire? Because it's of a different nature, and it's not simply a nation state that you can deal with.
It's harder for America to deal with intellectually, because in one of the great things about American life is that you almost never meet people that harbor irreconcilable hostility to you. American life is pleasant. People are basically friendly to each other. But here's a group of people that genuinely believe that by killing, they're advancing their cause, and they're willing to commit suicide. Then it's hard
and they're serving their God, so to speak.
And serving their God. Then it's hard for us and for everybody to deal with threats that are not states. We've now lived for a few hundred years with an international system based on states. But these are not states, and they're somewhere in between states and criminal groups.
Then I would say to the next president, if I was writing this memo, then we need to find cause so that we need to, in a sense, say that we want to find common cause with moderate Islamists.
Absolutely.
And how do we do that?
But in order for moderate Islamists to be able to do this, you also have to demonstrate to the radical Islamists that they cannot win. You have to defeat them. And the moderate Islamists have been conspicuous by their silence. You don't hear much from moderate.
And why do you think that is, and why can't we get them to be vocal and not silent?
Partly because the radicals have this tremendous ability now to murder people, and partly because the Islamic religion has not in the past permitted the separation between church and state, so that in a way it is harder for Muslims to break solidarity with any part of the Muslim world. It's a big problem for them. But as a fundamental issue, we should encourage a moderate groups in the Islamic world to work with us.
Has diplomacy failed us in our recent times?
No. We are living in one of those periods that happens every few hundred years, in which the nature of what is considered a just arrangement changes. As long as you had states and borders and sovereignty, you had one thing. In Europe in the 18th century, you had something like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was nobody thought of the nation. The idea didn't. Then the idea of the nation was developed, that people with the same language should be in the same grouping. So 25 years later, Austria was the sick man, one of the sick men of Europe. Now we are living in a world in which the nature of the states is changing. In the Middle East, the state never had the same role anyway, because it was created by the outside world and as a copy of the outside world. Now you have, on the one extreme, globalization, in which the nation is weakened. On the other extreme, you have religion. Then in between, you still have traditional states. And how you can get an international system in a world that is states and all these other movements, that is bound to produce problems. But I have actually, especially in the last months, developed the thought that yes, we are living in a period of tremendous turmoil now. But I think that at the end of this administration, with all its turmoil, and at the beginning of the next, we might actually witness the creation of a new order, because people looking in the abyss, even in the Islamic world, have to conclude that at some point ordered expectations must return under a different system. But you cannot wake up every morning wondering what horror is going to befall you. And so, yes, we are in a I find it interesting that somebody called a conference of ambassadors in Baghdad of all the surrounding countries, plus the Security Council, and everybody came. And it hasn't broken up. Of course it didn't settle anything yet, and it won't very necessarily quickly, but then they're adjourning to a foreign ministers meeting. Now, it's just the beginning, a very small step on a road which either this administration will have to travel further, or a new administration. Somewhere along the line, something like this must happen.
That's an appropriate place to end this conversation and as the beginning of a series of conversations, but it is to recognize that we are at one of those moments.
Absolutely.
Where there are forces at work,
but
and that people may be coming to an idea that we're looking at an abyss and need to come back from it, and you see some hope that might be starting.
It's also a great opportunity.
Thank you for coming. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. We began, as I said, this series of conversations with former secretaries of state, with people from not just the United States, but other countries, talking about this new world order and where we go from here. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.